I got to start this week by sharing a piece written by Peggy Noonan, the only political columnist I really like. Oh no, along with Rex Murphy, but that's my list. Anyways, Peggy was dealing with a subject that hasn't got much play despite the massive coverage of the political drama in the U.S. election. And that is, how did politics get to this sorry state? It's not just nostalgia that longs for leaders of the past. It was their character that is so blatantly different from what we're seeing today. Ms. Noonan compares the humility, integrity, and authenticity of President Harry S. Truman with what she's seeing today. And the differences couldn't be more stark. She writes, "We live in a time when politicians relentlessly enrich themselves. We're awed and horrified by the wealth they accumulate, by their use of connections, of money lines built on past and future power. It's an operation to them. They're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They have houses so fancy that the houses actually have names. They make speeches to banks and universities for $250,000 and call their fees contributions to their foundation. They are their foundations. They're operators, entitled, assuming. They don't stand for the people. They stand for themselves." I'm reading this and then immediately go to the latest on Mike Duffy. He's returned to the Senate, after the spending scandal. And he's right back claiming out-of-town expenses when he in fact, everyone knows his primary residence has been in Ottawa for decades, but he's claiming those out-of-town expenses again. Of course it sounds familiar, because it is. This is the same completely unethical practice that got him in trouble in the first place. He claims his private residence is in PEI. It's not. And then collects out-of-town expenses when in fact he lives in Ottawa. And this time, the Senate administration approved it. This is a blatantly false claim. In the court case, Judge Vaillancourt ruled in Mr. Duffy's favor because there was no definition of primary residency in the Senate rules. And there still isn't. But back to the greedy politicians that Ms. Noonan alludes to. Mr. Duffy's out-of-town residency expense claims amounted to $1,691.59 from March through to June of 2016. Well, come on. You'd think after the great dust-up over his expenses, he could have given this one a miss, especially because he knows, rules or no rules, it's bogus. I mean, come on. The base salary for a senator is $142,400. More if you take on extra duties like committee chair or vice chair. Of course, it's easy to see why 90% of the senators claim some of these out-of-town expenses. You know that if a senator's primary residence is more than $100K outside Ottawa, they can claim up to $22,000 per year in accommodation, plus a daily allowance of $29.28 for a secondary home. It's payable every day of the year. That adds up to $10,687, regardless of how many days the Senate sits. Senators are also entitled, by the way, to claim $92.70 for meals every day they're in the Capitol on Senate business if they have an out-of-town residence. That's $5,376 last year. Senators, they have a designated traveler. That'd be like my spouse in my case, and dependents. They're all allowed to fly business class. The formula is very complicated, but taxpayers are looking at about 60 flights per year. They also travel free on Via Rail. And if they travel on Senate business, they can claim the $92.70 per day for meals and incidentals. Same goes through that for that senator's designated traveler. I mean, my gosh, it just keeps going on. I mean, senators can claim $200 a night for hotels. If a senator chooses to stay with families or friends instead, they still can claim $50 a night. I love the National Post Chrissy Blatchford, the way she put it when she said, it looked like Mike Duffy went after every penny on the table. And he clearly still is. I mean, come on, he couldn't let go of $1,600 with all that other stuff happening. Now, luckily, when it comes to greed, I want to be clear. I think our self-serving politicians are just single-A players. They're in the minor leagues, while the U.S. is the major leagues. More revelations this week from Hillary's emails. Of course, the press didn't want to cover this one. These ones obtained through the Freedom of Information that show a very disturbing trend that the State Department, within 3 months of Hillary taking office, started to intermingle questionable business dealings with the Clinton Foundation. The Daily Caller reports the FBI is undertaking multiple investigations involving potential corruption charges against the Clinton Foundation. You got to keep in mind, 2013, the Clinton Foundation took in $140 million in donations and grants, but spent just $9 million in direct aid. But my point is that much like Duffy's explanation of the recent expense claims, our standard now seems to be, hey, if you aren't cuffed and jailed, everything goes. If Hillary and Bill's myriad of unethical dealings that stretch over 25 years are not below the acceptable standards for politicians, then again, anything goes. And the moral and ethical corruption that was described in the recent book Citizen X, it was written by an anonymous congressman, well, it's given all sorts of behavior the seal of approval. He writes in quotes, "Most of my colleagues are dishonest career politicians who revel in the power and special interest money that's lavished upon them. Is given all of that gets given the big green light. And you know what? Voters only have themselves to blame."